Let's begin at the very beginning, drifting into the ancient world shaped by salt. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're standing on the shore of an ancient sea, 6,000 years before the present day. The water laps gently at your feet. The sun beats down, warm and steady. And in the shallow pools left behind by the tide, something crystalline and white begins to form. This is where our story begins. Not with kings or empires, but with water, sun, and time. The first humans who tasted salt didn't know they had discovered something that would shape the course of civilization. They only knew that this strange white substance made their food taste better, made it last longer, made them feel stronger. We don't know their names. We never will. But we know where they lived. In the lands that would one day be called Romania, near the Black Sea, people were creating the world's first salt. The year was approximately 6,000 BCE. These ancient communities had learned something remarkable. If you boiled seawater in clay pots, again and again, eventually, all that remained was salt. Simple. Revolutionary. The pottery shards still exist. You can see them in museums today, marked with the white residue of that ancient brine. Evidence of humanity's first deliberate attempt to control this mineral, to make it theirs. But they weren't alone. On the other side of the world, in what we now call China, people had made the same discovery. Near Lake Yuncheng, in the Shaanxi province, communities were harvesting salt from the lake's natural deposits. The same year, the same realization, 6,000 years before Christ walked the earth. It's a curious thing, isn't it? How humans separated by thousands of miles, speaking different languages, living entirely different lives, arrived at the same understanding. Salt was precious. Salt was necessary. Salt was worth the effort. The Chinese would go further. They always did. Within centuries, they developed elaborate methods. They found underground brine deposits. They dug wells. They created evaporation ponds. They documented everything. Salt in China became a science. But why? Why did salt matter so much? The answer lies in a transformation that was sweeping across the human world. A transformation that changed everything. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had been hunters and gatherers. They moved with the seasons. They followed the herds. They ate what they killed, what they found. Their diet was rich in blood, in fresh meat, in the natural salts that exist in animal tissue. They didn't need to find salt. They ate it every day without trying. But then came agriculture. Around 10,000 BCE, humans began to settle, to plant crops, to domesticate animals, to stay in one place. It was the dawn of civilization as we know it. Cities would rise from this decision. Writing would be invented. Art, architecture, everything we call culture began with the choice to stop wandering. But there was a cost. The agricultural diet was grain-based. Wheat, barley, rice. These crops sustained life, yes. They allowed populations to grow, but they lacked something essential. Salt. The human body cannot produce salt. It cannot survive without it. Every cell, every nerve, every heartbeat depends on sodium and chloride. Without salt, muscles cramp. Thoughts become confused. Eventually, the body fails. Early farmers discovered this the hard way. As their diets shifted away from meat, their bodies began to crave something they couldn't name. An emptiness, a need. They needed salt. And so began the search. Some communities were lucky. They lived near natural salt springs, where underground deposits dissolved into water and bubbled to the surface. All they had to do was collect it, boil it down, harvest the crystals. Others lived near the sea. They could flood shallow ponds, let the sun do its work, and scrape up what remained. But those who lived inland, far from oceans or springs, faced a problem. They needed salt. But where would they find it? The answer would lead to humanity's first trade routes, the first merchants. The first concept of goods moving from one place to another in exchange for value. Salt became the reason to travel, the reason to connect, the reason to build roads that would still exist thousands of years later. In ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, salt was being extracted from marshlands around 3000 BCE. The Sumerians had a word for it, Namu. The goddess of the primeval sea shared a name with this essential mineral. That tells you something about how they saw it. Sacred. Fundamental. As old as creation itself. The Sumerians didn't just use salt for food. They understood its power to preserve. Fish could be salted and stored. Meat could last through seasons. Food could become a commodity, something to save, to trade, to build wealth upon. Preservation changed everything. It meant security. It meant surplus. It meant some people could stop farming and do other things. Become craftsmen. Become priests. Become scribes. Civilization needs specialists, and specialists need a reliable food supply. Salt made that possible, but salt was more than practical. From the very beginning, humans sensed something mystical about it. Salt came from the sea, and the sea was eternal. Salt could preserve flesh from decay. It could keep death at bay, at least for a while. It was white and pure. It sparkled in the sun like fragments of stars. Many ancient cultures used salt in their religious ceremonies. They offered it to their gods. They used it to purify their temples. They believed it had the power to ward off evil spirits. In some traditions, spilling salt was considered bad luck. Even today, we throw spilled salt over our shoulders without quite remembering why. The superstition has outlived its explanation. But 6,000 years ago, when salt was rare and precious, the reason was clear. To waste salt was to waste life itself. It was to disrespect the gods who provided it. Let's return to those clay pots in Romania for a moment. Picture the scene. A woman tends a fire. The flames flicker beneath a clay vessel, wide and shallow. Inside, seawater boils. The steam rises and disappears into the air, carrying with it everything that isn't salt. The water, the bitter compounds, the impurities. What remains grows thicker, more concentrated. Hour after hour, she adds more seawater, boils it down, adds more again. Finally, when enough water has evaporated, she sees them. Tiny white crystals beginning to form at the bottom of the pot. She lets it cool. She scrapes them out. This is salt. It took all day. Maybe longer. The firewood alone was a precious resource. The clay pots had to be carefully made, carefully tended. They crack sometimes from the heat. The whole process had to start again. But it was worth it. Because this salt would preserve her family's food through the winter. It would be traded for things they couldn't make themselves. Tools, cloth, pottery. This salt was survival. The same scene played out across the ancient world in variations. In China, workers dug deeper and deeper wells, following underground brine deposit. They developed bamboo pipes to bring the salty water to the surface. They built enormous evaporation ponds, organized and efficient. Along the Mediterranean coast, communities created salt pans, shallow pools where seawater could evaporate under the hot sun. The process was slower, but required less fuel. Nature did the work. In Africa, in the Sahara, people discovered rock salt. Entire mountains of it, left behind by ancient seas that had dried up millions of years ago. They could simply cut it from the earth. Pure, white, endless. Each culture, each geography found its own way. But the goal was always the same: to capture salt, to hold it, to make it yours. There's something poetic about salt when you think about it. It's made of two elements that are poisonous on their own. Sodium, a metal so reactive it bursts into flame when it touches water. Chlorine, a gas used as a weapon in warfare. But combine them, and you get something essential. Something that sustains life rather than destroying it. The ancient peoples didn't know this chemistry. They didn't know about elements or molecules. But they understood transformation. They understood that the sea gave them something they needed. That the earth held treasures beneath its surface. They understood that salt was a gift. By 3000 BCE, salt production had become an industry. Not in the modern sense, with factories and corporations, but in the ancient sense, with specialized knowledge passed from generation to generation, with trade networks forming, with value being assigned. In Mesopotamian cities, certain families became known as salt merchants. They controlled the supply. They set the prices. They grew wealthy from this white mineral. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout history. Salt concentrated power. It created hierarchies. Those who controlled it controlled the food supply. And those who controlled the food supply controlled everything else. But that's a story for later chapters. For now, we're still at the beginning. Still at the dawn. Imagine that woman again, by her fire, with her clay pot. The sun is setting now. The sky is painted orange and purple. The fire crackles. The last of the water evaporates, and she can see the crystals clearly now, thousands of them, catching the firelight. She doesn't know it, but she's part of something much larger than herself. Part of a story that stretches across continents and millennia. Part of the human story itself. Because salt isn't just a mineral. It's a thread that connects us. To each other. To our ancestors. To the very beginning of civilization. 6,000 years ago, someone figured out how to make salt. And that discovery rippled forward through time, touching every generation that came after. It touches us still. The dawn of salt was quiet. No great announcements. No monuments built in its honor. Just people, fires, and seawater. Just the patient work of boiling and scraping and storing. But from that quiet beginning, empires would rise. Trade routes would span continents. Wars would be fought. Revolutions would be sparked. All for salt. All for those white crystals forming at the bottom of a clay pot, reflecting the firelight, promising survival for another season. This is where it begins. Let's continue the journey. Salt in ancient Egypt and the cradle of civilization. The Nile flows north through the desert. It has flowed this way for millions of years. Brown water carrying the richness of Africa toward the Mediterranean. And along its banks, 3,000 years before the Common Era, the greatest civilization the world had yet seen was rising. Egypt, land of pyramids and pharaohs, of hieroglyphs and golden masks, of mysteries that still capture our imagination today. But beneath all that grandeur, beneath the temples and the tombs, there was salt. Always salt. The Egyptians didn't have to look far to find it. The Nile Delta, where the great river spreads out and meets the sea, provided natural salt pans. The sun did most of the work. Water evaporated. Salt remained. But the Egyptians needed more than just common salt. They needed something special. They needed natron. Natron wasn't quite the same as table salt. It was a mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. It came from dry lake beds in the Wadi Natron, a valley northwest of Cairo. In the scorching heat, These lakes evaporated completely during summer, leaving behind deposits of this precious mineral, white, crystalline, sacred. The Egyptians called it Enrai, the divine salt. And divine it was, because natron could do something that regular salt couldn't do quite as well. It could preserve flesh, not just fish or meat for eating, but human bodies for eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed in the afterlife with a conviction that shaped their entire civilization. Death wasn't the end. It was a transition. The body would be needed again. The soul would return to it. But bodies decay. Flesh rots. Bones crumble to dust. Unless you knew the secret. Unless you had natron. Picture a temple workshop in Thebes. The year is 1500 BCE. Inside, the air is thick with incense, frankincense, and myrrh, meant to cover other smells. The embalmers work by lamplight, their faces covered, their hands steady. Before them lies a body. A nobleman, perhaps. Or a priest. Someone whose family could afford the full 70 days of mummification. The embalmers have already removed the internal organs. The brain through the nose. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines through a careful incision in the side. These organs now rest in 4 canopic jars, themselves preserved, ready for the journey ahead. But the body remains, and the body is what matters most. They pack it in natron, cover it completely. Every surface, every cavity, the natron draws out moisture. It desiccates the tissue. It prevents bacterial growth. It transforms decay into preservation. For 40 days, the body lies in natron, becoming something else, something that will last. When they unwrap it, the skin is leather-like, dark, preserved. The embalmers wash it, anoint it with oils, wrap it in hundreds of yards of linen. Place amulets between the layers. Speak the proper prayers. And when they seal that body in its sarcophagus, they've achieved something remarkable. They've stopped time. Today, you can walk into museums around the world and see Egyptian mummies. 3,000 years old. 4,000. Some older still. Their faces recognizable. Their hair intact. Their bodies preserved by natron, by salt, by human ingenuity and faith. Natron made immortality possible, at least the Egyptian version of it. Is it any wonder they considered it divine? But natron wasn't the only salt the Egyptians used. Their diet required it, just like everyone else's. They preserved fish in salt, especially from the Nile. They salted meat. They used salt in bread making, in beer brewing, in every kitchen across the kingdom. The average Egyptian worker received salt as part of their rations. Not as payment exactly, as necessity. Try working in the desert heat without salt. Your body cramps. Your mind fogs. You become weak. Salt was survival, for the living as much as the dead. And salt meant trade. The Egyptians didn't exist in isolation. They knew the Mediterranean world. They sailed to distant ports. They brought back cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, gold from Nubia, and they traded with the Phoenicians. Ah, the Phoenicians, the great sailors of the ancient world. Based in what we now call Lebanon, in cities like Tyre and Sidon, they dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. They were merchants, explorers, innovators, and they loved Egyptian saltfish. The preserved fish from the Nile, salted, dried, packed for travel, was a delicacy in Phoenician cities. Easy to store, easy to transport, nutritious, delicious, apparently, though the recipe has been lost to time. In exchange, the Phoenicians brought the Egyptians things they couldn't get at home. Cedar wood, tall and straight, perfect for ship masts and temple pillars. Egypt had few trees. The cedar forests of Lebanon were legendary. They brought glass. The Phoenicians were master glassmakers. They could create vessels and jewelry in colors the Egyptians prized. And they brought something else. Something rare and expensive and deeply desirable. Tyrian purple. This dye made from sea snails could color fabric a deep, rich purple that didn't fade. It took thousands of snails to produce just a small amount. The process was secret, carefully guarded. Only the Phoenicians knew how. Purple became the color of royalty, the color of power. Emperors would wear it. Senators. Kings. And it came to Egypt in exchange for saltfish. Trade networks are funny things. They connect people who never meet. A fisherman on the Nile salts his catch. A merchant buys it, packs it in amphora, loads it on a ship. That ship sails to Tyre. A dyer in Tyre uses his payment to buy more snails, make more purple. That purple dye goes to Egypt on the return voyage. An Egyptian priest buys it for the temple. The priest's payment comes from tithes. The tithes come from workers, who are paid in grain and salt. Everything connects. Everything flows like the Nile itself. The Egyptians also used salt in their religious ceremonies, beyond just mummification. Salt appeared in purification rituals. Temples were cleansed with salt and water. Offerings to the gods included salt. It represented purity, preservation, incorruptibility. There's a hieroglyph for salt. It looks like 3 wavy lines over a bowl. Simple, essential. It appears in countless inscriptions. When the Egyptians wanted to say something would last forever, they compared it to salt. But Egypt's relationship with salt extended beyond its borders in another way. To the west, across the Sahara, salt was becoming something even more precious. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the salt trade routes of Libya. Caravans crossing the desert, bringing salt from northern deposits to trading posts in the interior. These weren't small operations. Hundreds of camels. Weeks of travel through waterless wastes. Why go to such trouble? Because in the interior of Africa, salt was scarce. And where salt is scarce, salt is valuable. The Saharan salt trade was just beginning in Egyptian times. It would grow much larger in later centuries. But even then, the principle was clear. Salt flows from where it's abundant to where it's needed, and wealth flows back in return. The Egyptians understood this. They facilitated it. They profited from it. Let's pause for a moment and consider what we're really talking about. Salt seems simple. It's on your table right now, probably. In a shaker. Cheap. Abundant. Forgettable. But for the ancient Egyptians, salt was bound up with their deepest beliefs about life and death. It was the substance that let them believe in eternity. It was the mineral that connected them to their gods. When they placed natron on a body, they were performing a sacred act. They were saying, "This person matters. This person will continue. Death is not the end." That's profound. That's religion and chemistry and hope all mixed together. And it worked. Those mummies exist. The preservation was real. Whether the afterlife was real is a question each person answers for themselves. But the preservation? That was natron. That was salt. By 1000 BC, Egypt's great age was beginning to wane. Other powers were rising. The Persians would conquer them. The Greeks would come with Alexander. The Romans would make Egypt a province. But the salt remained. The knowledge remained. The trade routes remained. Herodotus, that Greek historian, traveled through Egypt and wrote down what he saw. He described the salt pans, the natron beds, the preserved foods. He was fascinated by mummification, by this strange Egyptian practice of preserving the dead. He couldn't quite understand it. Greeks burned their dead or buried them. The idea of preservation seemed almost wrong to him. But he wrote it down anyway, and because he did, we know details we might otherwise have lost. History survives in strange ways. Through salt. Through the curiosity of a Greek traveler. Through hieroglyphs that scholars decoded 2,000 years later. Imagine standing in the Wadi Natron today. It's still there, still dry, still producing mineral deposits, though no one uses them for mummies anymore. The sun beats down just as it did 3,000 years ago. The heat is the same. The landscape is the same. In the shimmering distance, you might see the white crust of natron deposits, just as ancient embalmers saw them. They walked here. They collected the sacred salt. They carried it back to their temples and workshops. They believed they were doing holy work. And in a sense, they were. They were preserving memory, preserving identity, preserving the physical reality of people who lived and loved and died, so that we, thousands of years later, could still see their faces. That's what salt did for Egypt. That's what Egypt did with salt. The Egyptian relationship with salt lasted for 3,000 years. Dynasties rose and fell. Kingdoms merged and split. Pharaohs built monuments and died and were buried in them. But through all of it, the salt trade continued. The preservation continued. The daily use continued. Because civilization runs on necessities. Art and architecture are magnificent, yes. Religion and philosophy shape our minds. But underneath it all, people need to eat. They need their food to last. They need salt in their bodies. Egypt understood this. They built their eternity on practical foundations. Stone and salt. Pyramids and natron. The monumental and the mineral. Both were necessary. Both endured. The salt roads of Rome. There's a road that still exists in Italy. You can walk on it today if you like. It's called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It runs from Rome to the Adriatic Sea, about 240 kilometers. Parts of it are paved now, modern asphalt over ancient stones. But in places, you can still see the original Roman construction. Stone blocks fitted together without mortar, worn smooth by 2,000 years of feet, hooves, and wheels. This road was built for salt, named for salt, defined by salt, and it helped build an empire. Let's go back to the beginning. To the early days of Rome, when it was just a collection of villages on 7 hills beside the Tiber River. The year is roughly 500 BCE. Rome is not yet an empire. Not yet a republic, really. Just a city-state among many others, fighting for survival in a violent world. But Rome had something. A location. The Tiber gave them access to the sea, but they were far enough inland to be defensible. Hills gave them protection. Fertile land gave them food. And nearby, at the mouth of the Tiber, there were salt pans. The Romans didn't invent salt production. They learned it from the Etruscans, the civilization that dominated Italy before Rome's rise. But the Romans perfected it, expanded it, organized it. They built better pans, improved the evaporation process, increased production, and then they built a road to move that salt inland. The Via Salaria began at the salt pans. It climbed through the hills. It crossed rivers and valleys. It reached deep into the Apennine Mountains, where tribes who had no access to the sea desperately needed salt. The Romans brought them salt. And in return, those tribes gave Rome something even more valuable: loyalty. See, the Romans understood something fundamental about power. It's not just about conquest. It's about necessity. If you control what people need to survive, you control the people. The mountain tribes needed salt. Rome had salt. The arrangement was simple. Buy Roman salt, trade with Rome, accept Roman influence, eventually accept Roman rule. The Via Salaria wasn't just a trade route. It was a strategy. But why the Adriatic? Why did the Via Salaria run east instead of west to the closer Tyrrhenian Sea? The answer is in the water itself. The Adriatic Sea is shallower than the Tyrrhenian. It's more enclosed. The sun beats down on it, and it doesn't circulate as much with the deeper Atlantic. All of this means one thing: the Adriatic is saltier. And saltier water means better salt production. Less water to evaporate to get the same amount of salt. More efficiency. Better profits. The Romans were practical people. They chose the better source. So they built their road east, and the salt flowed west, into the growing city, out along other roads to other cities, down into the very veins of the expanding Roman world. Now, let's talk about soldiers. A Roman legion was a formidable thing. Disciplined, trained, equipped with the best armor and weapons of their age. These men conquered Gaul, Egypt, Britannia, Germania. They marched from one end of the known world to the other. And they needed salt. Not just for their food, though that was important. Roman soldiers ate salted fish, salted pork, salted vegetables. Food that could be transported, that wouldn't spoil on long campaigns. But more than that, they needed salt for their bodies. Marching in armor under the Mediterranean sun. Training. Fighting. Sweating. Without salt, a soldier becomes useless. His performance drops. His body fails. The Romans understood this, so they gave their soldiers a salarium. The word literally means salt money. It was an allowance, a payment specifically for buying salt. Whether it was actually paid in salt or in coins to buy salt is debated by historians. Probably both, at different times and places. But the word stuck. Salarium. Salary. Think about that next time you get paid. The word we use for our wages comes from salt. Comes from Roman soldiers being given money to buy this white mineral. Are you worth your salt? That expression comes from the same place. It means, are you worth what you're paid? Are you worth the salt allowance? Language preserves history in unexpected ways. As Rome grew from city to republic to empire, salt production expanded with it. The coast of Italy became lined with salt works. Enormous evaporation ponds, carefully maintained. Workers raking salt from the dried beds, loading it into amphora, moving it to warehouses. From there, onto carts and boats, dispersing throughout the empire. Salt from Sicily, salt from Spain, salt from North Africa, all flowing into the Roman economic system, because Rome was becoming something unprecedented. A city of 1 million people. Think about that. 1 million people in a world where most settlements had a few thousand at most. 1 million mouths to feed. You can't feed 1 million people without preservation. Without salt, the logistics were staggering. Grain from Egypt and North Africa. Olive oil from Spain. Wine from Gaul. And salt, always salt, to preserve the fish, the meat, the vegetables that kept Rome fed. The Romans built an empire on organization, on roads and aqueducts and ports, on the ability to move goods efficiently from where they were produced to where they were needed. Salt was the test case. If you could organize the salt trade, you could organize anything. And speaking of food, let's talk about garum. You've probably never heard of it, but in ancient Rome, it was everywhere. In every kitchen, rich or poor, on every table, in almost every recipe. Garum was a fermented fish sauce. Small fish anchovies, mackerel, whatever was cheap and abundant, mixed with salt and left to ferment in the sun for months. The fish broke down. The mixture liquefied. What remained was a salty, savory, incredibly pungent sauce. It sounds disgusting to modern ears, but the Romans loved it. They put it on everything: meat, vegetables, fruit, desserts even. It was their ketchup, their soy sauce, and it was made with salt. Lots of salt. The fermentation process required salt to prevent the wrong kind of bacteria from taking over. Too little salt, and the mixture would rot. Too much, and the fermentation wouldn't happen. The Romans had to get it exactly right. They did. Garum became an industry unto itself. Factories in Spain and North Africa produced it in vast quantities. The most expensive garum, made from specific fish caught at specific times, could cost as much as perfume. The Roman author Pliny the Elder wrote about it. The poet Martial joked about it. Everyone had an opinion on which garum was best. And all of it depended on salt. The Romans also used salt in their religious ceremonies. Like the Egyptians, like most ancient peoples, they saw something sacred in it. Salt was offered to the gods, sprinkled on sacrifices, used in purification rituals. The Vestal virgins, the priestesses who tended Rome's sacred flame, used salt in their rites. There was a Roman saying, "Nihil utilius sol et sale." Nothing is more useful than sun and salt. It was true then. It's true now. But Rome's relationship with salt wasn't just practical. It was political. As the empire expanded, control of salt became a tool of governance. Rome established salt monopolies in some provinces. In others, they taxed it heavily. Either way, they made money from it. And they used that money to build more roads, more aqueducts, more legions, more empire. It's a cycle. Control a resource, profit from it. Use those profits to expand your control. Control more resources. Rome perfected this. And salt was one of their primary resources. Imagine you're a Roman merchant in 100 CE. The empire is at its height. Trajan is emperor. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia. You deal in salt. You buy it from producers on the coast of Sicily. You ship it to Ostia, Rome's port. From there, it goes into the city, or further, to Gaul perhaps? Or Germania, or Dacia. You know the quality. You know the prices in different markets. You know which officials to pay to avoid delays. You know which routes are safe and which are plagued by bandits. You're not romantic about it. It's business. But you're also aware that what you do matters. That without your work, without salt, the empire would struggle. You're right to think so. The mundane trades are the ones that hold civilization together. Not the generals or the emperors, though they get the glory. The merchants, the transporters, the producers, the people who move salt from one place to another. Roman engineering made all of this possible. Those roads weren't just the Via Salaria. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads throughout their empire. All of them connected. All of them maintained. A merchant could travel from Rome to Londinium, London entirely on Roman roads. A soldier could march from Syria to Spain and never leave the empire. And salt could flow freely throughout this enormous territory. That's the thing about empires. They create systems. Economic systems, political systems, physical systems of roads and ports and warehouses. And those systems outlast the empires themselves. The Roman Empire fell in 476 CE in the west, later in the east. But the roads remained. The trade routes remained. The knowledge remained. Medieval Europe would inherit all of it. The salt trade would continue. The Via Salaria would still carry travelers, even when no one remembered the full story of why it was built. Let's return to that road for a moment. The Via Salaria. Walking it now, in modern Italy, You pass through landscapes that have changed and landscapes that haven't. Some parts run through cities now. Rome has sprawled far beyond its ancient boundaries. Highways parallel the old road. But in places, it's still quiet, still recognizably ancient. Stone blocks worn into gentle curves by millennia of use. Trees growing beside it, their roots working into the ancient foundation. People still walk it. Tourists, pilgrims, Italians out for a hike. They may not know they're walking the salt road. May not know this path was built for commerce 2,000 years ago. But the road knows. It remembers. In its stones, in its path, in the way it climbs hills and crosses valleys exactly where Roman engineers determined was most efficient. Roads are memories made physical. Rome gave us many things. Language, much of English comes from Latin. Law, our legal systems echo Roman principles. Architecture, we still build with Roman techniques. Government, the very word republic, is Roman. But maybe the most fundamental legacy is simpler. The Romans taught the Western world how to organize, how to think big, how to connect distant places into coherent systems. The Via Salaria was just one road. Salt was just one commodity. But together they demonstrated a principle that would shape the next 2,000 years of history. Control the necessities, build the infrastructure, expand the network. That's how you build something that lasts. That's how you build Rome. Salt in ancient Asia. While Rome was building its roads on the other side of the world, another civilization was perfecting an entirely different approach to salt. China had been working with salt for 4,000 years already. While Europeans were still figuring out basic evaporation, the Chinese had turned salt production into a science. They had to. China is vast. Much of it is far from any ocean. Mountains separate the coasts from the interior, and hundreds of millions of people needed salt. The Chinese solution was elegant, ingenious, and it would influence salt production for millennia. Let's travel back to the Shaanxi province, around 2700 BCE. This is the same region near Lake Yuncheng where salt production first began 6,000 years ago. But now, something new is happening. The Chinese have discovered underground brine deposits. Deep beneath the earth, ancient seas left behind pockets of salty water. The Chinese are learning to reach them. They dig wells, not small wells. Deep wells, going down hundreds of feet. They develop tools to drill through rock. They create bamboo pipes to line the wells to bring the brine to the surface. It's remarkable engineering for the Bronze Age. But the Chinese have always been remarkable engineers. At the surface, they build evaporation ponds. Large, shallow basins where the brine is heated by the sun or by fire. The water evaporates. The salt remains. But there's more. The Chinese realize that different brines produce different qualities of salt. Some are pure. Some contain minerals that affect the taste, the texture, the color. They learn to identify the best sources, to refine their product. By 2000 BCE, they're documenting all of this, writing it down. The Peng Sao Kan Mu, one of the earliest known pharmacological texts, describes salt production methods. 40 different types of salt, distinguished by source and quality. Think about that. While most of the world was still treating salt as just salt, the Chinese had 40 varieties. But wells and evaporation weren't enough for China's needs. The country was growing. Populations were rising. The salt demand was enormous. So the Chinese government did something radical. They made salt a state monopoly. It happened during the Qin dynasty, around 221 BCE. The Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the same emperor who built the Great Wall, who created the Terracotta Army, declared that all salt production and distribution would be controlled by the state. No private salt. No independent merchants. Everything went through the government. Why? Revenue. Salt was essential, which meant everyone bought it. Tax salt, and you tax everyone. Control salt, and you control a massive source of income. The monopoly lasted in various forms for over 2,000 years. Different dynasties modified it, but the principle remained. Salt was too valuable, too essential, to leave to the free market. Was it good policy? That depends on your perspective. It generated enormous wealth for the imperial treasury. It funded wars, construction projects, the vast bureaucracy of the Chinese state. But it also led to smuggling, to black markets, to salt pirates who would risk execution to sell illegal salt at lower prices. Wherever there's a monopoly, there's an incentive to break it. The Chinese also developed something else, the tea and horse caravan road. This wasn't one road. It was a network of routes connecting China to Tibet and beyond. Tea grown in southern China was carried north and west. Horses from the steppes were brought south and east. And salt was part of the trade. Always salt. Tea preserves well, but the journey was long and dangerous. The caravans crossed mountains, deserts, hostile territories. They traveled for months. Salt was both cargo and currency. It could be traded. It could preserve food for the journey. It was valuable anywhere. The caravans created connections. Chinese culture spread. Tibetan culture spread. Buddhism traveled these routes. Ideas, technology, art, all flowing along paths originally established for trade. For tea and horses and salt. In Chinese medicine, salt held an important place. The ancient physicians understood that the body needed salt. Too little caused weakness, confusion, death. Too much caused its own problems, swelling, strain on the heart. Balance. Always balance. That was the Chinese way. Salt appeared in herbal remedies. Mixed with other ingredients, it was used to treat digestive problems, to clear heat from the body, to restore equilibrium. The concept of yin and yang extended to salt. Salt was yang active, preserving, preventing decay. It balanced the yin forces of coolness and moisture. Traditional Chinese medicine isn't just about treating illness. It's about maintaining harmony. Salt was one tool among many for achieving that harmony. Now let's travel south and west. To India. The Indian subcontinent has its own ancient relationship with salt. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's earliest urban cultures, was producing salt 3,000 years ago. Maybe earlier. India has several sources. Coastal areas where the sea provides endless supply, but also, remarkably, underground deposits. The Chura salt mine in Pakistan, still in operation today, has been mined for over 2,000 years. Walking into Chura is like entering a cathedral made of salt. Walls of pink and white crystal, chambers carved from solid salt. The air tastes of it. The ancient miners didn't have modern equipment. They used picks and hammers. They followed the salt veins by lamplight. Dangerous work. Essential work. The salt from Chura is unusual. It's pink, colored by trace minerals. Iron oxide, mainly. It's the same salt marketed today as Himalayan pink salt, though calling it Himalayan is somewhat misleading. It's from the Punjab region, near but not in the Himalayas. Still, it's beautiful. And it was prized even in ancient times. Salt in Hinduism carries sacred weight. It appears in religious ceremonies, in weddings, in birth rituals, in funerals. It represents purity, prosperity, preservation. There's a story in Hindu tradition. A king asks his 3 daughters how much they love him. The first 2 give elaborate answers, comparing their love to gold, to jewels. The 3rd daughter says simply, I love you as much as salt. The king is insulted. Angered, he banishes her. Later, through a series of events, the king eats a meal prepared without salt. Everything tastes wrong, flat, lifeless. He realizes the truth. Gold and jewels are luxuries. Salt is necessity. The daughter's love was the most profound, because it was essential. It's just a story, but it captures something true. Salt seems humble, but life without it is impossible. In Ayurvedic medicine, India's traditional healing system, salt plays multiple roles. Different salts for different purposes. Sea salt for one condition, rock salt for another, black salt Kala Namak with its distinctive sulfurous smell for digestion. Ayurveda is thousands of years old, and throughout that time, salt has been part of the pharmacopoeia, not just for flavoring, for healing. The ancient texts describe 6 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, pungent, astringent. Each taste affects the body differently. Each has its place in maintaining health. Salty taste, they say, aids digestion, moistens, nourishes, but in excess it agitates, creates heat, disturbs balance. Everything in moderation. Everything in its proper place. East again, to Japan, an island nation. Salt from the sea would seem obvious, but Japan's seas are deep. The tides are strong. Simple evaporation ponds, like those in the Mediterranean, don't work as well in Japan's climate. Too much rain, too much humidity. So the Japanese developed their own methods. They would collect seawater in large pots and boil it over fires. Labor-intensive, fuel-intensive, but effective. Later, they developed the Irihama method. Seawater was sprinkled on sand. The sand was then heated, and the salt-impregnated sand was washed. The resulting brine was more concentrated than straight seawater, making the final boiling process more efficient. Ingenious. Wasteful by modern standards, perhaps. But this was before industry. Before efficiency was measured in energy costs. It worked. Japan had salt. In Japan's interior, particularly in the Shinano province, modern-day Nagano, there were no easy sources of salt. Landlocked. Mountainous. The people there needed salt just as much as anyone else. So trade routes developed. The Shio no Michi, the salt roads. Merchants would carry salt from the coast into the mountains. On their backs sometimes, or on pack horses. Difficult journeys through mountain passes. But profitable. Salt was expensive in the interior. People would pay. They had no choice. These salt roads became important cultural arteries, not just for salt, for all goods, for travelers, for ideas. Villages along the routes prospered, became trading posts, became towns. Even today, you can follow some of these old salt roads. They're hiking trails now. Beautiful paths through forests and mountains. People walk them for the scenery, for the exercise. They may not think about the merchants who once struggled along these same paths carrying salt. But the paths remember. Let's pause here and consider the bigger picture. We've moved from China to India to Japan. 3 distinct cultures. 3 different geographies. 3 separate approaches to the same problem. How do you get salt to everyone who needs it? China drilled wells and built a massive state monopoly. India mined underground deposits and integrated salt into its religious and medical traditions. Japan developed specialized evaporation techniques and established mountain trade routes. Each solution fit its context. Each culture adapted salt production to its circumstances. But the underlying truth was the same everywhere. Salt was essential. Salt was valuable. Salt shaped economics, politics, culture. This pattern repeated across Asia. In Southeast Asia, in Korea, in Tibet, in Persia. Everywhere humans lived, they needed salt. And everywhere they needed it, they found ways to get it. There's something beautiful about that. About human ingenuity applied to fundamental needs. We tend to celebrate the dramatic innovations, the inventions that changed everything overnight. But most human progress is quieter. It's people figuring out how to do necessary things a little bit better. How to dig a well deeper. How to make a pond evaporate more efficiently. How to carry salt across a mountain range. Incremental improvements over generations. That's how civilizations advance. Salt production exemplifies this. From that first clay pot 6,000 years ago to the sophisticated operations of ancient China, each step building on the last. By the first millennium CE, Asian salt production was the most advanced in the world. The Chinese were drilling wells deeper than anyone else. They had better evaporation techniques, better distribution networks, and they were documenting everything. Chinese scholars wrote extensively about salt, its production, its economics, its importance to the state. Later, when Europeans finally established contact with Asia, they were stunned by what they found. Cities larger than anything in Europe. Technologies Europe wouldn't develop for centuries. And salt production that put European methods to shame. It's a humbling reminder. The West wasn't always the most advanced. For most of history, Asia led in technology, in organization, in sophistication. Salt is one piece of that story, but it's an important piece. Imagine standing by a salt well in ancient China. The sun is setting. Workers are bringing up the day's final load of brine. The evaporation ponds stretch into the distance, glinting in the fading light. This well has been operating for generations. The same families have worked it for hundreds of years. They know every quirk of the equipment, every sign that a well is producing well or starting to fail. Their knowledge is passed down, father to son, mother to daughter. Not written in books, though some of it is. Mostly just shown, demonstrated, practiced until it becomes instinct. This is how most knowledge moved through history, not through formal education, through apprenticeship, through family, through doing. The salt they produce here will travel hundreds of miles, will preserve food, will season dishes, will sustain life. They don't think about it in grand terms. It's just work, but it's also everything. Medieval Europe and the golden age of salt trade. The Roman Empire fell. Not all at once, but slowly across centuries. The last Western emperor was deposed in 476 CE. The roads began to crumble. The aqueducts broke. The great systems collapsed. Europe entered what historians used to call the Dark Ages, though that name is unfair. Light was still there. It just moved, scattered into monasteries, into small kingdoms, into the slow rebuilding of civilization. And salt? Salt continued, because people still needed to eat, still needed to preserve food, still needed this white mineral. But the production and trade shifted, became localized, became medieval. In England, there were the Domesday Witches, 4 towns whose names ended in witch, an Old English word meaning a place where salt was made. Middlewich, Nantwich, Northwich, Droitwich. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he wanted to know exactly what he'd conquered. He commissioned a great survey. Every piece of land, every resource, everything of value. The Domesday Book, one of the most important documents in English history. And there, carefully noted, were these 4 salt towns, their brine springs, their production capacity, their value to the crown. Droitwich was the most productive. Brine springs that had been used since Roman times, maybe earlier. The water there was incredibly salty, 10 times as concentrated as seawater, which meant less work to extract the salt, more profit. The method was straightforward. Pump the brine from the springs into lead pans. Lead had replaced ceramic by this time, more durable and efficient. Heat the pans over fires. Wait for the water to evaporate. Scrape up the salt. Simple in concept, exhausting in practice. The work was hot. The steam filled the salt houses. The fires burned constantly. The workers, mostly women and children, in the medieval division of labor, stirred and scraped and packaged. For some families, it was their entire livelihood. Salt making passed from generation to generation. A craft, a skill, a way of survival. But England was small scale compared to what was happening in Germany. Elneberg, a town in northern Germany about 50 kilometers south of Hamburg. Unremarkable in most ways, except for one thing. Beneath Elneberg lay salt deposits of almost pure sodium chloride, a gift from an ancient sea that evaporated millions of years ago. The mining began around 900 CE. At first, small operations, local production, but Elneberg salt was exceptional. Pure, white, highly valued. And Elneberg had access to the river systems that connected to the Baltic Sea. The combination was powerful. High-quality salt, easy transportation, and a growing market in Scandinavia and the Baltic region, where the herring trade was exploding. Herring, small fish migrating in enormous schools through the Baltic and North Seas. Easy to catch in vast quantities. But herring spoils quickly unless preserved, unless salted. Elneberg salt and Baltic herring created one of the most important economic relationships of the Middle Ages. The herring were caught, packed in barrels with Elneberg salt, and shipped throughout Europe. Salted herring became a staple. Cheap protein, reliable nutrition. Especially important for Catholic Europe, where religious law forbade meat on Fridays and during Lent. You needed fish for those days, and you needed salt to preserve it. The Hanseatic League. If you've heard of it, you know it was one of the most powerful economic organizations in medieval history. If you haven't, you should. The League was a confederation of merchant cities around the Baltic and North Seas. German cities, mostly. Beck, Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig. But also cities in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, even England. They banded together for mutual protection and profit. Negotiated as a bloc. Established trading posts. Even had their own military forces. And salt was one of their primary commodities. Elneberg salt, in particular, flowed through Hanseatic networks. The League controlled its distribution, set the prices, ensured steady supply. Their power was immense. They could blockade ports, wage economic war, make or break cities by granting or denying access to their trade networks. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1200 to 15 CE, the Hanseatic League dominated Northern European trade. They were medieval proto-globalists, creating economic systems that transcended national boundaries. And salt specifically, the salt needed for the herring trade, was one of the foundations of their power. South and east, in Poland, something else was happening. Something that would create one of the most remarkable sites in medieval Europe. The Wieliczka salt mine. Salt had been produced there since prehistoric times. Surface deposits, easy to gather. But by the 14th century, those surface sources were depleted. So the miners went deeper. They dug shafts, excavated chambers, followed the salt veins deep into the earth. They went down 100 meters, then 200. Eventually, 300. The mine grew into something extraordinary. Miles of tunnels. Enormous chambers carved from solid salt. Underground lakes of brine. At its peak, Wieliczka produced 40,000 tons of salt per year. It employed thousands of workers. Generated enormous wealth for the Polish crown. But it was more than just a mine. The miners, spending their lives underground, created art. They carved chambers into chapels, made sculptures from salt, even chandeliers made entirely from salt crystals, clear and sparkling like ice. The chapel of St. Kinga, carved in the 17th century, is the size of a small church. Everything in it, walls, floor, altarpiece, even the religious figures carved from salt. Hundreds of feet underground. Why would miners do this? In their spare time after exhausting labor? Maybe faith. Maybe beauty. Maybe the need to create something lasting. Something more than just the salt they extracted to be sold and consumed and forgotten. The chapel remains. You can visit it today. Touch walls made of salt. See altarpieces that have stood for centuries in the unchanging air of the deep mine. It's humbling. These were ordinary workers. Not artists. Not priests. Just miners. But they made something extraordinary. Let's talk about Salzburg for a moment. The name literally means salt fortress in German. The city sits on the Salzach River, the Salt River. The river was used to transport salt from mines in the nearby Alps to Salzburg, and from there throughout Europe. The wealth from salt built Salzburg, the fortress on the mountain, the cathedral in the valley, the merchants' houses, everything. The archbishops of Salzburg controlled the salt monopoly. They became princes in their own right. Rich, powerful, ruling a territory that was nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire, but effectively independent. Salt did that. Gave religious leaders temporal power. Made them princes as well as priests. This pattern repeated throughout Europe. Salt meant wealth. Wealth meant power. Power meant control of more salt. A cycle. Always a cycle. Medieval Europeans ate differently than we do. Meat was central to the diet, at least for those who could afford it. But fresh meat was only available at certain times. Most meat was preserved, salted, packed in barrels with enough salt to last months or years. The technique was important. Too little salt, the meat spoiled. Too much. It became inedible, leaching the moisture from your mouth, making you desperately thirsty. Medieval cooks knew the balance. They could tell by touch, by taste, by experience exactly how much salt a piece of meat needed. Before cooking salted meat, you had to soak it. Change the water several times. Leach out the excess salt. Then it was edible. Not fresh, no, but nutritious. And available in the dead of winter when no animals were being slaughtered. Salt let medieval people survive the winters. Store the autumn harvest of meat through to spring. Without salt, many wouldn't have made it. The word salad comes from the Latin salata, meaning salted, because the Romans salted their vegetables. Medieval Europeans continued the practice. They salted cabbage to make sauerkraut, salted cucumbers for pickles, salted beans, roots, greens. These weren't just preservation techniques. They were ways to create variety in a limited diet. Different flavors, different textures, and the salt itself was changing food culture, making new dishes possible, creating regional specialties. Italian salted anchovies, French fleur de sel, English Maldon salt. Different salts for different purposes. The idea that salt is just salt, that it doesn't matter where it comes from or how it's made, that's a modern notion. Medieval people knew better. They could taste the difference. They had preferences. They would pay more for salt from certain sources. Salt had become sophisticated. By the 15th century, Europe was producing salt on an enormous scale. But it still wasn't enough. The population was growing. Cities were expanding. The demand kept increasing. Trade networks extended further. Italian salt came north. Portuguese salt was shipped to England and Flanders. Bay of Bourgneuf salt from the Atlantic coast of France became highly prized for the herring trade. Different salts for different uses. Fine salt for the table. Coarse salt for preserving meat. Specialized salt for butter making, for cheese, for baking. The salt trade employed thousands. Merchants, sailors, warehouse workers, coopers making barrels, carters hauling loads. In some cities, salt merchants formed guilds, powerful organizations that controlled who could sell salt, at what price, under what conditions. They became wealthy, built great houses, endowed churches, commissioned art, all from salt. There were salt wars, actual military conflicts over control of salt sources. Cities went to war with each other. Kingdoms competed. The Venetians and Genoese fought over Mediterranean salt trade. The Hanseatic League blockaded ports to enforce their monopoly. Salt was worth fighting for, worth dying for. Not romantic, perhaps. Not the kind of wars that fill history books. No great heroes. No famous battles. Just merchants and soldiers and sailors fighting over the right to sell salt. Over access to mines. Over trade routes. But these were real conflicts. Real deaths. Real consequences. Salt mattered. Enough to fight over. Picture a salt ship sailing from the Bay of Bourgneuf to London in 14. It's a relatively small vessel, maybe 50 tons. Crew of a dozen men. The hold is packed with salt. Barrels and barrels of it. The ship sits low in the water from the weight. The sailors pray for good weather. A storm could sink them, or at minimum damage the cargo. Salt absorbs moisture. Get it wet, and it clumps, loses value. The voyage takes days, sometimes weeks, depending on winds. The English Channel is treacherous. Pirates lurk. Weather changes quickly. But the profit is worth the risk. Salt bought cheap in France sells dear in England. The merchants who organize these voyages can become wealthy. Some don't make it. Ships sink. Crews are lost. But more ships sail. Always more. Because the demand never stops. London needs salt. York needs salt. Bristol needs salt. Every town, every village, everyone needs salt. So the ships keep sailing. Salt and the age of exploration. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain, seeking a route to Asia. He didn't find Asia. He found something else entirely. 2 continents. A new world. And how did Columbus finance his voyage? There are many factors. Royal patronage. Investment from merchants. But one significant source of funding came from Spanish salt production. The salt pans of southern Spain were immensely profitable. The Spanish crown used that revenue for various purposes. Funding expeditions was one of them. Salt money paid for the ships, for the crews, for the supplies, for the voyage that would change world history. It's a reminder. The dramatic moments of history, the discoveries, the revolutions, the great changes are usually funded by mundane things. Salt. Taxes. Trade revenues. Columbus wasn't thinking about salt when he sailed. He was thinking about spices, gold, glory. But salt helped put him on that ship. Let's stay in Europe for a moment. The Renaissance is in full bloom. Art is flourishing. architecture, science, humanism, and table manners. The Middle Ages were rough in many ways. Eating was communal, messy, informal. People ate with their hands, shared trenchers, threw bones on the floor for dogs. But the Renaissance brought refinement, etiquette, the idea that how you ate mattered. Enter the salt cellar. At a medieval table, salt might be kept in a bowl or a simple container. Functional, nothing special. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, salt cellars were becoming works of art. Elaborate sculptures in gold, silver, or crystal. Ornate designs featuring mythological figures, animals, intricate patterns. The most famous is the Salaria, created by Benvenuto Cellini for Francis I of France. Pure gold, depicting Neptune and a personification of Earth. Took years to create. Priceless. It was a salt cellar, a container for salt. Why such extravagance? Because at a Renaissance banquet, where you sat in relation to the salt cellar indicated your social status. Above the salt meant you were important, a noble, close to the host. Below the salt meant you were lower status, a minor guest, still invited, but not honored, a mineral, a condiment, but also a social marker, a statement of hierarchy visible to everyone at the table. Salt had transcended its practical function. It had become symbolic. While European artists were crafting elaborate salt cellars, African traders were moving actual salt across the Sahara. The Saharan salt trade was one of the great commercial networks of the medieval and Renaissance periods. It connected North Africa to sub-Saharan kingdoms, brought wealth to cities like Timbuktu, created empires. Here's how it worked. In the Sahara Desert, there are salt deposits, enormous ones. Mountains of salt left behind by ancient seas. The most famous is Taudeni in what's now Mali. Miners would cut blocks of salt from the deposits. Large blocks, sometimes weighing 50 kilograms or more. They'd load these blocks onto camels. Then came the journey, south across the Sahara. One of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Blazing heat during the day, freezing cold at night. No water, no vegetation, just sand and rock and the brutal sun. The caravans were large, hundreds of camels, dozens of traders, armed guards against raiders, guides who knew the routes, who could navigate by stars and landmarks. They traveled for weeks, months sometimes, following ancient paths from oasis to oasis, praying they'd find water, praying the sandstorms would hold off. Many didn't make it. Caravans got lost, died of thirst, were attacked. The desert took its toll. But those who survived reached the markets of West Africa, places where salt was scarce, where it was desperately needed. And there, salt traded for gold, pound for pound. Salt for gold. It sounds incredible. Gold is precious, rare. Salt is salt. Common, right? Not if you live in the interior of West Africa. Not if the nearest source is 1,000 miles away across the deadliest desert on Earth. In Ghana, in Mali, in the kingdoms of West Africa, salt was essential. Their diet was grain and vegetable-based. They needed salt for nutrition, for preserving food, for survival. And they had gold. Rivers and mines produced it in abundance. Gold was valuable, yes, but you can't eat gold. You can't preserve food with it, so they traded gold for salt. The thing they had for the thing they needed. The Empire of Ghana grew wealthy from this trade. Then the Mali Empire. Then Songhai. These weren't primitive societies. They were sophisticated kingdoms, with universities, with literature, with complex governance systems. Timbuktu became one of the great cities of the medieval world, a center of learning, of commerce, of culture, built on salt and gold. European explorers were amazed when they finally reached these kingdoms. They'd heard rumors, stories of unimaginable wealth, of gold so common it was used for everyday items. They didn't understand at first, didn't grasp that the salt trade was what made it possible. That the reason West Africa had so much gold was that they traded it for necessities. Eventually, Europeans inserted themselves into these trade networks. Portuguese traders established coastal posts. They brought salt by ship from Europe or from Cape Verde. It was cheaper than trans-Saharan salt, undercut the caravan trade, changed the economics. The old kingdoms declined. The balance shifted. European influence grew. In time, this would lead to colonization, to exploitation, to the Atlantic slave trade, to centuries of suffering. But in the 1400s and 1500s, it was still primarily trade. Exchange. African kingdoms dealing with European traders on relatively equal terms. Salt was part of that exchange. Not the only part, but a significant one. Back to the ships. The age of exploration was fundamentally about maritime expansion, and ships needed preserved food. Salt cod became one of the most important trade goods of this era. Cod was abundant in the North Atlantic. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland teemed with them. You could catch cod in enormous quantities. Fishermen would gut the fish on deck, pack them in salt, or dry them in the sun with salt. The result was hard as wood. Lasted for months, years even. Salt cod could be transported anywhere. To the Caribbean, where plantation workers needed cheap protein. To the Mediterranean, where it became a dietary staple. To South America. To Asia. The Basque people from the region between France and Spain became masters of the salt cod trade. They fished the Grand Banks before Columbus even sailed. They established temporary camps on the coast, dried and salted their catch, brought it back to Europe. Later, English, French, and Portuguese fishermen joined in. The cod fishing industry became huge, employed thousands, generated enormous wealth, and it all depended on salt. Without salt to preserve the catch, the fish would rot before the ships made it home. The whole industry would be impossible. The Spanish established colonies in the Americas, the Caribbean islands, Mexico, Peru. They needed salt there too. The Caribbean had natural salt pans, shallow lagoons that evaporated in the tropical sun. Salt accumulated naturally. The Spanish exploited these, shipped salt throughout their colonial empire, used it to preserve food for their colonies, for their treasure fleets sailing back to Spain. The English, French, and Dutch also established salt operations in the Caribbean. Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, these islands became important salt producers. Salt was strategic. Control it, and you could support colonies, navies, merchant fleets. Lose access to it, and your colonies struggled. There were conflicts over salt-producing islands, military operations, treaties that included salt provisions. A white mineral, crystals formed by sun and sea, but worth fighting over. Let's consider what exploration meant in terms of salt. Medieval Europe had local salt, regional salt, salt from relatively nearby sources. But the age of exploration created global salt networks. Spanish salt went to the Americas. Caribbean salt came to Europe. African salt traded through Portuguese posts. Asian salt entered European markets via new maritime routes. For the first time, salt from one side of the world could reach the other. Not easily, not cheaply, but it could. This globalization of the salt trade was part of a larger phenomenon, the emergence of a global economy, of interconnected trade networks spanning continents and oceans. We think of globalization as modern, as a product of the 20th century. But it began in the 1500s and 1600s, with explorers and merchants, with ships crossing oceans, with goods flowing in previously impossible patterns. Salt was one of those goods, essential enough to be worth the cost and risk of global transport. There's a darker side to this story. We should acknowledge it. The colonial expansion of the 16th and 17th centuries brought immense suffering. Indigenous populations in the Americas were decimated by disease and violence. African kingdoms were destabilized. The Atlantic slave trade began, transporting millions of people in chains across the ocean. Salt was part of this system. Slaves in the Caribbean worked in salt pans under brutal conditions. Salt was used to preserve food on slave ships. Salt production in the colonies depended on forced labor. The economic networks that moved salt around the world were the same networks that moved enslaved people. That exploited colonies, that concentrated wealth in European capitals, while impoverishing other regions. History is complicated. The same era that produced Renaissance art and scientific advancement also produced colonialism and slavery. Salt doesn't carry moral weight on its own. It's just a mineral. But the systems built around it, the trade networks, the economic structures, the colonial enterprises, those had profound moral implications. We can appreciate the ingenuity of salt production and trade, while also recognizing the human cost of the systems that distributed it. Both things are true. Still, there were moments of beauty and wonder. Merchants encountering new cultures, the exchange of ideas along with goods, technology spreading, knowledge growing. A Portuguese sailor trying salted fish from Japan for the first time. Different from European methods, but recognizably the same principle. Salt preserving protein. A Spanish soldier in Mexico seeing indigenous people extracting salt from volcanic lakes. Methods unknown in Europe, but effective. An English trader in India learning about different types of salt. Black salt, rock salt, sea salt, each with its own properties and uses. These encounters weren't always peaceful, weren't always equal. But they were encounters. Human beings meeting across vast distances, recognizing commonalities. Everyone needed salt. Everyone figured out how to get it. The methods varied, but the need was universal. That's something. A thin thread of shared experience across all humanity. Picture a salt cellar on a Renaissance table in Florence. Gold. Elaborate. Catching the candlelight, surrounded by nobles in silk and velvet, music playing, conversations about art and philosophy and politics, and picture a camel caravan in the Sahara, men wrapped in cloth against the sand, salt blocks strapped to the camels' backs, the endless horizon, the brutal sun, the quiet determination to reach the next oasis. And picture a fishing boat off the Grand Banks. Sailors gutting cod, salt spray in their faces, hands raw from the work. The hold filling with salted fish, the hope of profit, the risk of storms. 3 scenes, 3 different worlds, connected by salt. Salt, revolution, and independence. Something was changing in the 18th century. Slowly at first, then faster. A transformation that would reshape the world. The Industrial Revolution. We think of it in terms of steam engines and factories, iron and coal, railways and machines. And yes, those were all part of it. But the Industrial Revolution was also about salt, about producing it faster, more efficiently, in greater quantities than ever before. about making salt cheap, making it abundant, making it accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy. This seems small, perhaps, but it mattered. It changed daily life for millions of people. The key innovations came in production methods. The pan process and the grainer process, technical terms for new ways of evaporating brine. The pan process used large, shallow metal pans heated from below. The heat could be controlled precisely. The evaporation happened faster. The salt crystals that formed were more uniform. The grainer process was more sophisticated. It created a specific type of salt crystal, flaky, hollow pyramids, ideal for certain uses. It required skill to maintain the right temperature, the right evaporation rate. These weren't revolutionary in the sense of steam engines, but they were significant improvements. They increased output, reduced labor, made salt production less of an art and more of a science. And they required capital. You needed to build the facilities, buy the equipment, hire workers, train them. Small-scale salt-making couldn't compete. The old methods, boiling brine in small quantities, sun evaporating in modest pans, became obsolete. Salt production consolidated, became industrialized, became capitalist. But before salt became cheap, it was still expensive, still taxed, still a source of revenue for governments. In France, the tax was called the Gabelle. It was old, medieval, but by the 18th century, it had become hated, despised, a symbol of everything wrong with the French monarchy. Here's why. The Gabelle wasn't uniform across France. Different regions paid different rates. Some regions were exempt entirely. It was arbitrary, unfair, and it wasn't just a sales tax. In some areas, every person was required to buy a minimum amount of salt per year, whether they needed it or not, at government-set prices, from government-approved merchants. You couldn't make your own salt, couldn't buy from anyone else, had to pay the inflated official price. For poor families, this was a significant burden. They needed every coin for food, for rent, for survival. Forcing them to buy expensive salt they might not fully need was cruel. Smuggling became common. People would sneak salt from low-tax regions into high-tax regions, sell it illegally, risk harsh penalties, even execution, for the profit. The government employed thousands of tax collectors to prevent smuggling, searched homes, arrested people, created an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment. The Gabelle became one of the grievances that led to the French Revolution. Paris. The streets are filling with angry people. The Bastille falls. The king is losing control. The ancient art game is collapsing. Among the many complaints of the revolutionaries, the Gabelle, the salt tax. One of the early acts of the revolutionary government was to abolish it, to make salt freely available, to end the monopoly and the forced purchases and the unfair regional differences. The people celebrated. It was tangible, real, a burden lifted. Of course, the revolution became complicated, turned violent. The guillotine, the terror, war. And ironically, Napoleon would eventually reinstate a salt tax. Not as harsh as the Gabelle, but still. The government needed revenue. Salt was an easy target. The revolutionaries had overthrown a king partially because of a salt tax. And within years, they were taxing salt again. It's almost funny, if it weren't so tragic. Across the Atlantic, another revolution was brewing. The American colonies, British rule, growing tensions. Salt played a role here too. A smaller role than in France, but real nonetheless. The British controlled salt imports to the colonies. They preferred the colonies to depend on Britain for necessities, including salt. The colonies produced some salt locally, but not enough. They needed imports. When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, one of the immediate problems was salt. British naval blockades disrupted supply. The Continental Army struggled to preserve food. Civilians hoarded what they could get. Salt prices spiked. Shortages were common. The colonies tried to increase local production, built salt works along the coast, encouraged anyone with the means to produce salt. But it was difficult, time-consuming, expensive. Some historians argue that salt shortages impacted the war effort significantly. Armies can't function without preserved food. Neither can civilian populations. The British knew this. Controlling salt was strategic. One more way to pressure the colonists into submission. It didn't work, obviously, but it made the struggle harder. After independence, the new United States had to figure out salt production. They needed it domestically, didn't want to depend on imports. There were salt springs in various locations: New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia. The federal government recognized the importance. They reserved certain lands for salt production. The Land Act of 1795 included provisions for salt reservations, publicly owned land, where salt could be extracted for public benefit. It was one of the early federal interventions in natural resources. The government saying, "This mineral is too important to leave entirely to private enterprise." Private companies still produced most salt. But the government retained some control, some oversight, some land reserved for national needs. In Syracuse, New York, there were extensive salt springs. Native Americans had used them for centuries. European settlers recognized their value. By the early 1800s, Syracuse was producing massive amounts of salt. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, made transportation easy. Salt from Syracuse could reach the entire northeastern United States cheaply. Syracuse became known as Salt City. Its economy depended on salt. Its growth was fueled by salt. Its workers, its businesses, its civic identity, all bound up with this mineral. The salt works were visible everywhere. Evaporation sheds, solar ponds, boiling houses, the smell of brine in the air, the white residue on equipment and buildings. It wasn't glamorous work. Hot, exhausting, repetitive, but it was employment. It built a city. The Erie Canal itself is worth pausing on. The ditch that salt built, some called it. It connected Lake Erie to the Hudson River. 363 miles of canal, an engineering marvel for its time. And one of the primary cargoes? Salt. Moving salt from Syracuse and other locations along the canal route to New York City and beyond, making it cheap and available. Before the canal, transporting bulk goods overland was prohibitively expensive. The canal changed that. Suddenly, heavy, low-value goods could be moved economically. The canal helped the American economy grow, integrated the interior with the coast, made New York City the commercial capital it would become. Salt didn't build the canal alone, but salt was part of the calculus, part of the reason it made economic sense. As America expanded westward, salt remained crucial. In new territories, Illinois, Nebraska, the Dakotas, finding salt sources was a priority. Salt springs were discovered. Small operations established. Some frontier towns grew around salt production. Others failed when salt ran out or better sources were found elsewhere. It's a reminder. America's westward expansion wasn't just cowboys and gold rushes. It was also about necessities, about establishing the infrastructure of daily life. Salt was part of that infrastructure. There's another substance worth mentioning, saltpeter. It's not the same as table salt chemically, it's potassium nitrate. But the name connects it to salt, and it was often found in similar contexts. Saltpetre was used to make gunpowder, essential for military purposes. In the 17th and 18th centuries, obtaining enough saltpetre was a national security concern. Countries established saltpetre farms, encouraged its production. The process was unpleasant, involved collecting soil rich in animal waste, processing it through a series of steps to extract the saltpetre. But it was necessary. Without gunpowder, you couldn't wage modern warfare. And without saltpetre, you couldn't make gunpowder. So alongside regular salt production, there was this parallel industry. Less talked about, less romantic, but militarily crucial. By the mid-1800s, salt production had become genuinely industrial in scale. Large operations, significant capital investment, integrated supply chains. In Michigan, companies began drilling deep into ancient salt deposits left by prehistoric seas. They extracted brine from hundreds of feet underground, pumped it to the surface, evaporated it in massive facilities. West Virginia developed similar operations. The brine there was particularly rich, pure, ideal for large-scale production. These weren't the small family operations of earlier centuries. These were corporations, with investors, with workers organized into shifts, with production targets and profit margins. The Industrial Revolution had reached salt, and the effects rippled outward. Cheaper salt meant better food preservation, which meant less waste, better nutrition, healthier populations. It meant the food industry could develop meat packing, canning, commercial food production on a scale previously impossible. All of it needed salt. And now, salt was available. Let's pause and reflect on what had changed. In 17, salt was still expensive, still controlled by monopolies and taxes, still scarce enough that smuggling was common. By 1850, salt was becoming a commodity. Cheap, abundant, accessible. This transformation took 150 years. Doesn't sound dramatic when you say it that way, but for the people living through it, it was profound. Their grandparents might have struggled to afford salt. They could buy it easily. That's progress, not the kind that gets monuments built, not the kind historians focus on, but progress nonetheless. Material improvement, making life a bit easier, a bit less precarious. For millions of ordinary people, that mattered more than any grand historical event. The American Civil War and salt as weapon. April 1861. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Confederate artillery opens fire. The American Civil War begins. For 4 years, brother would fight brother. States would be devastated. Over 600,000 people would die. More American deaths than in any war before or since. And throughout it all, both sides would fight over something that seems mundane. Salt. Armies need food. Obvious, right? But feeding an army in the field is complex. Difficult. Especially in the 1860s, before refrigeration, before modern canning, before rapid transportation. You need food that lasts, that can be stored, that can be moved. You need salted meat, salted fish, salted vegetables. You need salt. Both the Union and the Confederacy understood this. But their situations were very different. The Union controlled most of the major salt production centers: Syracuse, New York, the Michigan deposits, access to imports through their ports. The Confederacy had some salt production, but not enough, not nearly enough. This would become one of their critical weaknesses. The Confederacy's primary salt sources were along the coasts, salt works in Florida, Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic, These were simple operations. Seawater pumped into shallow ponds, evaporated by the sun. The salt scraped up and packaged. They produced enough salt for civilian needs in peacetime. But wartime was different. An army consumes enormous quantities, and the Confederate army was large. The South needed more salt, desperately. So they built more salt works, expanded existing ones, pressed every coastal area into production. But they had a problem: the Union Navy. The Union blockade strategy was to seal off southern ports, prevent trade, cut off supplies, starve the Confederacy economically and literally. And those coastal salt works? Easy targets for Union ships. Union raids on salt works became common. A gunboat would approach the coast, shell the facilities, land Marines who would destroy the equipment, burn the sheds, poison the brine. The Confederacy would rebuild. The Union would come back. Again and again. It was economic warfare. Deny the enemy necessities. Make their situation impossible. For the Confederate soldiers and civilians, it was more than economic. It was their food supply, their ability to preserve meat through the winter, their survival. Salt prices in the Confederacy soared. What cost pennies before the war now cost dollars. If you could find it at all. Smugglers tried to bring salt through the blockade. Some succeeded. Many didn't. The Union captured their ships, confiscated their cargo. The Confederate government tried to establish salt monopolies, control distribution, prevent hoarding and price gouging. It didn't work well. When a commodity is scarce, markets find ways around controls. Black markets flourished. Salt became a form of currency, worth more than Confederate paper money in some cases. Let's look at specific examples. In Florida, there were extensive salt works at St. Andrews Bay, critical to Confederate supply in the Western Theater. Union forces raided them in 1862, destroyed the equipment, captured workers. The Confederates rebuilt. The Union came back in 1863, destroyed them again. In Louisiana, salt works on the Gulf Coast faced constant harassment. The Union controlled New Orleans. From there, they could easily strike at coastal facilities. The Confederacy responded by moving production inland where possible, finding salt springs, digging wells. But inland salt was less pure, required more processing. And transportation from inland sources to the armies was difficult. Virginia had some salt deposits in the western mountains. The Saltville area, it became strategically crucial. Both sides fought for control of Saltville. Battles were waged over a mineral deposit. Men died to secure or deny access to salt. Think about that. Military operations planned around salt. Officers making strategic decisions about whether to attack or defend salt works. It sounds almost absurd, but it was serious. Deadly serious. The Union, meanwhile, had the opposite problem. They had plenty of salt. The challenge was logistics, getting it to the armies in the field. Union quartermasters organized salt shipments. Railroads carried it south as Union forces advanced. Wagons distributed it to supply depots. It was a massive undertaking. But the Union had the industrial capacity, the organizational structure, the resources. They could keep their armies fed, and that advantage, among others, helped them win. Civilians in the South suffered the most from salt shortages. Without it, preserving food became nearly impossible. Families tried alternative methods: smoking meat without salt, drying it, storing it in cool places. But these methods were less effective. Food spoiled more easily. Nutrition declined. Malnutrition became common. There are accounts of Confederate families eating food that was spoiling because they had no salt to preserve it. Children sick from tainted meat. Adults weakened from poor diets. War is terrible in obvious ways. Combat, death, destruction. But it's also terrible in these quiet ways. The slow erosion of daily life. The inability to do simple things like keep food safe. Salt shortages were one of many hardships, but they were a significant one. A daily reminder of how the war was affecting everything. By 1864, the Confederacy was losing. Militarily, economically, psychologically. Salt shortages were both a cause and a symptom. Cause, because without adequate food preservation, the armies weakened. Symptom, because the inability to protect coastal saltworks showed declining Confederate strength. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, one of the lesser discussed aspects was that his army was starving. Literally, they had run out of supplies, including salt. Union forces had been well fed throughout the war, not luxuriously but adequately. Confederate forces, especially toward the end, were often hungry. It's hard to fight when you're hungry. Hard to march. Hard to think clearly. Hard to maintain morale. Salt mattered, in ways both obvious and subtle. After the war, the United States needed to rebuild. The South was devastated. Economically, physically, socially. The salt industry was part of that rebuilding. Production increased. New facilities were built. The salt works that had been destroyed were restored. And something interesting happened. The center of American salt production started to shift. Michigan became dominant. The salt deposits there were enormous. The technology for deep drilling and extraction had improved, and Michigan was well positioned for distribution via the Great Lakes and railroads. By 1880, Michigan was producing more salt than any other state. Companies like the Michigan Salt Association controlled vast operations. Similar developments occurred in West Virginia, in Kansas, in other states with substantial underground deposits. The industry consolidated, became more efficient, more profitable. Technology was improving rapidly. Vacuum evaporation was developed. This method used reduced pressure to lower the boiling point of brine, made the evaporation process more energy efficient. The salt produced was purer, more uniform, better quality. Industrial chemistry was becoming sophisticated. Scientists understood salt, not just practically, but theoretically. They could manipulate the production process precisely, create different crystal sizes, different purity levels. Salt tailored for specific applications. This wasn't just about making food taste good anymore. Salt was becoming an industrial chemical, used in manufacturing, in processing other materials. The uses multiplied. Textiles, leather tanning, soap making, chemical production. Salt was everywhere in the industrial economy. Not visible to consumers, perhaps, but essential to countless processes. Let's talk about deep drilling for a moment. This was genuinely innovative. Engineers developed drill rigs that could go down hundreds, then thousands of feet, reaching salt deposits that earlier generations couldn't access. They'd drill the well, line it with casing, pump water down. The water would dissolve the salt, creating brine. Pump the brine back up, process it at the surface. It was mining without going underground. Safer, more efficient, scalable. And it meant regions without surface, salt could become producers. All they needed was salt somewhere beneath them and the capital to drill for it. This expanded the geography of salt production, made more regions reduced dependence on coastal sources. By 19, The United States was producing over 4 million tons of salt per year. That's a staggering amount. Think about the logistics, the equipment, the workers, the distribution networks, and that was just the U.S. global production was much higher. Salt had gone from scarce to abundant, from expensive to cheap, from a limited commodity to a nearly unlimited resource. This transformation happened in about a century, from 18 to 19. The Industrial Revolution applied to salt. The effects were far-reaching. Food became safer, more varied, cheaper. Industries that depended on salt could expand. Food processing, meat packing, pickle making. All these became large-scale industries. Cities could grow larger because you could feed more people reliably. It's hard to overstate the importance of this. The modern world urban, industrial populace depended on being able to feed millions of people. And that depended on food preservation, which depended on salt. There's a certain irony here. Salt, which had been fought over for millennia, which had funded empires and sparked revolutions, which had been one of the most valuable commodities in human history, was becoming cheap, not worthless, still necessary, still produced and consumed in enormous quantities, but no longer scarce, no longer precious in the way it once was. You wouldn't go to war over salt anymore, wouldn't tax it heavily, wouldn't build your economy around controlling it. In becoming abundant, salt lost its strategic importance, but gained something else: ubiquity. It became part of the infrastructure of modern life, invisible but essential. Picture a Union soldier in 1865, after the war. He's returning home, traveling by train through Pennsylvania. The landscape is marked by industry, factories, mines, railroads. He passes a salt plant, smoke rising from its chimneys, workers moving about, train cars being loaded with salt for distribution. 4 years ago, he might not have noticed it. Salt was just salt, something you used without thinking about. But he spent 4 years in an army, seen salt shortages, known hunger, understood, in a visceral way, how everything depends on these mundane substances. He'll never take salt for granted again. Never forget that civilization rests on practical things: food, water, salt. The grand ideas of the war union, freedom, nation, mattered. But so did the salt that preserved the rations. So did the logistics that kept armies functioning. Both things were true. Both necessary. Gandhi's Salt March and colonial resistance. India, 1930. March 12. An old man, thin and bald, wearing simple white cloth, begins to walk. He carries a walking stick. Behind him, 78 followers, all walking south toward the sea. His name is Mohandas Gandhi. Soon, the world will call him Mahatma. Great soul. He's walking to make salt, to break an unjust law, to shake an empire. This is the Salt March, one of the defining moments of the 20th century. And it began with something as simple as salt. Let's understand the context. India had been under British rule for nearly 2 centuries. The British East India Company first. Then, after 1858, the British Crown directly. The British controlled everything: government, military, economy. They extracted wealth from India, sent it back to Britain, built an empire on India's resources and labor, and they controlled salt. The British Salt Act of 1882 made it illegal for Indians to produce or sell salt independently. All salt had to come through British sources, be taxed by British authorities. The tax wasn't enormous in absolute terms. But for poor Indians, and most Indians were poor, it was significant. A burden, an irritation. More than that, it was symbolic. Salt was everywhere, abundant in a land with thousands of miles of coastline. Anyone could collect seawater and evaporate it. It was one of the most basic resources. And the British said, "You can't. You must buy from us. Pay our tax." It was petty colonial control taken to an extreme. It affected everyone, rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim. Every Indian paid the salt tax. That's what made it perfect. Gandhi was a lawyer, educated in London, sophisticated, well-spoken. But he had developed a philosophy of resistance. Satyagraha, truth force or soul force. The idea that you could resist injustice non-violently, through civil disobedience, through moral courage. He'd used it in South Africa, fighting discrimination against Indians there. Now, back in India, he was applying it to British rule. He'd been thinking about how to challenge the British. What issue would resonate with all Indians? What action would be both symbolic and practical? Salt. The answer was salt. Everyone needed it. Everyone resented the tax. Breaking the salt law would be clear, understandable, righteous. And it would be non-violent. Just walking to the sea, making salt. No weapons. No aggression. Just defiance. Gandhi announced his plan. He would walk from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal village of Dandi. 240 miles. 24 days. Along the way, he would speak in villages. Gather supporters. Build momentum. At Dandi, he would collect seawater. Boil it. Make salt. Break the law. He invited others to join him. He challenged the British to stop him. The British dismissed it at first. An old man walking to make salt? It seemed absurd. Harmless. They didn't understand what Gandhi understood. That symbols matter. That moral clarity matters. That sometimes a simple act carries enormous weight. March 12, 1930. The walk begins. Gandhi is 61 years old, not in perfect health, but determined. The 78 who walk with him are carefully chosen, representing different regions of India, different religions, different castes, all united in this act of defiance. They walk 12 miles per day, stopping in villages at night, sleeping wherever they can, eating simple food. Gandhi speaks to villagers, explains what they're doing, why it matters. He asks them to join when the time comes, to make their own salt, to break the law peacefully. The message spreads. Word travels ahead of the marchers. People come out to see them, to offer support, to walk alongside for a few miles. The British watch. They're no longer dismissing this. It's becoming something larger than they anticipated. But what can they do? Arrest Gandhi for walking? It would look ridiculous. Make him a martyr. They decide to wait. See what happens when he reaches the coast. The march continues, day after day, through heat and dust, past fields and villages, along dirt roads worn smooth by centuries of feet. Gandhi speaks every evening about independence, about non-violence, about the dignity of all people, about the injustice of foreign rule, but also practical things, about sanitation, about education, about treating each other with respect regardless of caste or religion. He's not just leading a protest. He's teaching, building a movement, creating a vision of what India could be. More people join. Hundreds, thousands. The procession grows. Journalists follow. Indian papers, yes, but also international press. The New York Times sends a reporter. The world is watching. April 5th, 24 days after starting. The marchers reach Dundee. Thousands of people have gathered. They've come from surrounding areas. They've come to witness, to participate. The next morning, April 6th, Gandhi wakes early, bathes in the sea, prays. Then, at dawn, he walks to the beach, bends down, picks up a small lump of natural salt left by the tide. That's it. That's the act. Picking up salt. He holds it up, says, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." It sounds grandiose, but he's right. What happens next is crucial. Gandhi has broken the law. Publicly, deliberately, symbolically. He encourages others to do the same. Make salt. Sell salt. Defy the British monopoly. And people do. All along the Indian coast, in villages and cities, people boil seawater, collect salt, sell it openly. Millions of people breaking the law simultaneously. What can the British do? Arrest millions? They try. They arrest Gandhi in early May. They arrest other leaders. They arrest thousands of ordinary Indians. The jails fill. They're not designed for this many prisoners. Conditions become terrible, and the arrests just make more people angry, more determined. The British try harsher measures. They beat protesters. In Darsana, north of Dundee, police attack peaceful demonstrators with steel-tipped clubs. Hundreds are injured. Some die. The violence is filmed, photographed, reported internationally. The images are shocking. Peaceful Indians, dressed in white, approaching a salt works. British police beating them. The Indians not fighting back, just falling. Others stepping forward to take their place. Wave after wave. Accepting violence, not returning it. It's heartbreaking. It's inspiring. It's satyagraha made visible. And it turns global opinion. Britain is supposed to be civilized, democratic, a nation of laws. But here they are, beating unarmed people. Over salt. It looks tyrannical, cruel. The Salt March didn't immediately free India. That would take 17 more years. Until 1947. Until after World War II. Until Britain was exhausted and couldn't maintain empire anymore. But the Salt March changed something. It showed that British rule could be challenged, that non-violent resistance could work, that Indians could unite across differences when they had a common cause. It made Gandhi an international figure, a symbol of peaceful resistance, and it demonstrated the power of simple acts. Walking, making salt, refusing to obey unjust laws. Sometimes the most powerful protests are the most basic. Let's think about what Gandhi understood that the British didn't. The British thought practically. Salt was a revenue source, a monopoly, a matter of economics and administration. Gandhi thought symbolically. Salt was dignity, self-sufficiency, the right to something basic and necessary. The British saw enforcement, rules, consequences. Gandhi saw justice, morality, the fundamental wrongness of one people controlling another's access to essentials. The British had power, armies, police, courts, jails. Gandhi had truth, or at least he had a moral clarity that resonated with millions. In the short term, power wins. The British arrested Gandhi, suppressed the protests, maintained control, but in the long term, moral clarity wins. Because empires depend on legitimacy, on the belief that they have a right to rule. The Salt March undermined that legitimacy, made British rule look absurd, unjust, untenable. 17 years later, India would be free. There's a deeper lesson here about salt, about necessities, about control. Throughout history, those who controlled salt controlled power. We've seen this repeatedly. Roman roads, medieval monopolies, French taxes, British colonialism. But Gandhi showed that this control was ultimately unstable, that you couldn't maintain it against the moral weight of injustice. When you tax or monopolize something people truly need, you create resentment. And resentment, given the right spark, becomes resistance. The British had made salt a symbol of their control. Gandhi turned it into a symbol of their oppression. And symbols matter. Sometimes more than practical facts. After independence in 1947, India abolished the salt tax. Indians could make and sell salt freely. It seems like such a small thing, but it mattered. It was one of the first acts of the new government, fulfilling Gandhi's vision. Today, India is the third largest salt producer in the world, behind China and the United States. Millions of tons per year. Some of it comes from the same coastal areas where Gandhi marched, where people defied the British and made salt. The salt industry is modern now, industrial, efficient, no longer a point of political conflict. But the memory remains. Every Indian knows about the Salt March. It's taught in schools, commemorated, celebrated. Gandhi's act of picking up salt on that beach in Dandi is one of the defining images of Indian history. And beyond India, the Salt March influenced resistance movements worldwide. Martin Luther King Jr. studied Gandhi's methods, applied them to the American Civil Rights Movement, peaceful protests, civil disobedience, moral clarity in the face of violence. Nelson Mandela in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement. They drew from Gandhi's example. Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in California. Peaceful resistance, fasting, symbolic acts, even later movements. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the Arab Spring. Wherever people resisted peacefully, there's an echo of Gandhi. And it began with salt. With a 240-mile walk, with an old man bending down on a beach and picking up a small crystalline lump. History turns on small moments sometimes. This was one of them. Picture Gandhi on that beach at dawn. The sun just rising over the Indian Ocean, the waves gentle, the sand cool beneath his feet. He's tired from the walk. His body aches. He's not young anymore, but there's determination in his movements. Purpose. He knows what this moment means. He reaches down, picks up the salt, holds it up to the light. The crystals catch the sun, sparkle. Around him, thousands of people, waiting, watching, understanding that this simple act is also a profound declaration. We will be free. We will govern ourselves. We will not be ruled by laws that deny us basic dignity. It's just salt, but it's also everything. The modern age from scarcity to abundance. Let's come home now, to the present, to a world where salt is everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere in that it's abundant, cheap, accessible. Nowhere in that we barely think about it. This is the story of how salt became invisible, and in becoming invisible, became more important than ever. The transformation began in the early 20th century. Industrial production had made salt cheap, but it was still just salt, a seasoning, a preservative, a commodity. Then someone had an idea, a simple idea that would save millions of lives. What if we added something to salt? Something people needed. Something that would reach everyone because everyone ate salt. What if we added iodine? Iodine is a trace element. Your body needs tiny amounts. But without it, your thyroid doesn't function properly. You develop goiter, a swelling of the thyroid gland in the neck. Your metabolism slows. Your development is affected. In children, severe iodine deficiency causes intellectual disabilities, stunted growth, permanent damage. In the early 1900s, iodine deficiency was common, especially in inland areas, away from the ocean. The soil lacked iodine. The food grown in that soil lacked it too. Millions of people suffered from goiter. Millions of children were affected by deficiency. Doctors understood the problem. But how do you get iodine to everyone? Most people couldn't afford supplements, wouldn't know to take them. The solution was elegant. Add iodine to salt. Just a tiny amount, barely detectable, but enough. Enough to prevent deficiency in anyone who ate normal amounts of salt. Switzerland tried it first. In 1922, they began iodizing salt. The results were remarkable. Goiter rates plummeted. Children born after 1922 showed normal development. The United States adopted iodization in 1924. By the 1930s, it was widespread. Other countries followed. By the mid-20th century, most developed nations had iodized salt programs. The impact? Hundreds of millions of people spared from goiter. Millions of children spared from developmental disabilities. It's one of the great public health successes of the modern era. Simple, cheap, effective. And it worked because salt reaches everyone. Rich and poor, urban and rural. Everyone eats salt. That universal reach, which had once been exploited for taxes and control, now became a tool for public good. But salt wasn't just about food anymore. The chemical industry was discovering new uses. Many new uses. The most important was the chlor-alkali process. This method used salt to produce chlorine and sodium hydroxide caustic soda, both essential industrial chemicals. Chlorine for water treatment, making drinking water safe, purifying swimming pools, manufacturing plastics, producing thousands of chemical compounds. Sodium hydroxide for papermaking, soap production, chemical processing, oil refining. Today, about 60% of salt production goes to these industrial uses. Only 6% is for direct human consumption. The rest is split between various industrial applications and de-icing roads in winter. We eat salt, but mostly, we use it for things we never see. Things that make modern life possible. Let's talk about winter roads. This seems mundane, but it's important. In cold climates, ice on roads is dangerous. Before salt, people used sand for traction, or just accepted that winter roads were hazardous. Then cities started using salt. Rock salt. Spread on roads and highways. It lowers the freezing point of water. Ice melts. Roads stay clear. The effect was transformative. Winter driving became safer. Transportation could continue even in heavy snow. Economic activity didn't shut down for months, but it requires enormous amounts of salt. Millions of tons per year in the United States alone. A single snowstorm can use thousands of tons in a major city. This created new demands on the salt industry. Storage, distribution, specialized equipment, and new concerns about environmental impact. All that salt running off into streams and groundwater, affecting ecosystems, corroding infrastructure. Modern societies are trying to balance safety with environmental responsibility, using salt more efficiently, developing alternatives for some situations. But for now, salt remains the primary way we keep winter roads safe. Global salt production is staggering. In 2022, the world produced about 280 million metric tons. China leads by far. 64 million tons, nearly a quarter of global production. Their ancient mastery of salt has become industrial dominance. India produces about 30 million tons. The United States, 39 million. Germany, Netherlands, Chile, Canada, all major producers. The methods vary. Some salt comes from mines, ancient deposits deep underground, extracted like coal or other minerals. Some comes from solar evaporation, seawater in shallow ponds, the sun doing what it has for millennia, leaving salt behind. Some comes from solution mining, drilling into deposits, pumping water down, bringing brine up, evaporating it in facilities. Each method has advantages. Mined salt is pure but expensive. Solar salt is cheap but dependent on climate. Solution mining is flexible but uses significant water. The industry has optimized all of them, made them efficient, sustainable to varying degrees. Salt has also become diverse. Not all salt is the same anymore. Table salt, fine crystals, iodized, the standard, kosher salt, larger crystals, used in cooking for better texture and control. Sea salt, evaporated from seawater, often containing trace minerals, prized by gourmets. Himalayan pink salt, from Pakistan, colored by iron oxide, expensive, fashionable. Fleur de sel, flower of salt, hand-harvested from the surface of salt pans. Delicate, costly, black salt, Kala Namak, from India, with a sulfurous smell, used in specific cuisines. Smoked salt, salt that's been smoked with wood, for flavor. The list goes on. Dozens of varieties, each with its advocates, its specific uses, its price point. Salt has become gourmet, artisanal, a thing to care about and choose carefully. It's fascinating. 6,000 years ago, people desperately sought any salt at all. Now, we debate which type to use for which dish. Abundance creates variety, allows for specialization, for preferences. The salt market in 2022 was valued at about $32.6 billion. It's projected to reach $48.6 billion by 2030. This growth comes from industrial uses primarily. As economies develop, they need more chemicals, more water treatment, more manufacturing capacity. All of that needs salt. Developing nations are where much of the growth is happening. As they industrialize, their salt consumption increases dramatically. China's growth in the past 50 years exemplifies this. They went from moderate production to global dominance. Not just for export, for their own massive industrial needs. India is following a similar path. Huge domestic demand, growing production, becoming more self-sufficient. This is the pattern of development. Industrialization requires salt, not as food, as raw material for chemistry. Let's pause and consider the arc we've traced. 6,000 years ago, someone in Romania boiled seawater in a clay pot, created salt deliberately for the first time. That act began a chain of events that led everywhere. To Egyptian mummies preserved in natron, to Roman roads named for salt, to medieval monopolies and Renaissance artistry, to Gandhi walking to the sea, to modern chemical plants processing millions of tons. Salt has been thread running through all of human civilization, sometimes visible, often invisible, always essential. We fought wars over it, built cities around it, taxed it, monopolized it, rebelled against control of it. And now we have more salt than we know what to do with. Production far exceeds demand in some regions. Prices are low, stable, boring. But that abundance is the victory, the culmination of millennia of effort. There are still places where salt matters in traditional ways. Remote areas where production is local, small scale, done by hand. In some parts of Africa, salt caravans still cross the desert, not as the primary method of distribution, but as a living tradition, a connection to the past. In coastal villages around the world, people still evaporate seawater in small ponds, make salt the way their ancestors did, sell it at local markets. These practices are becoming rare. Economically, they can't compete with industrial production, but they persist because tradition matters, because some knowledge shouldn't be lost. There's something valuable in knowing how to make salt from seawater, in understanding the process physically, not just abstractly. It connects us to our past, reminds us that what seems simple salt, water, sun is actually profound. Environmental concerns are rising, though. Salt production isn't without impact. Solar evaporation uses vast amounts of land and water. In some regions, this creates conflicts with other uses. Solution mining can affect groundwater, cause subsidence if not done carefully. Industrial uses of salt create waste products. Chlorine production generates byproducts that need management. And the salt we spread on roads? It accumulates, affects soil salinity, enters freshwater systems, changes ecosystems. We're learning to be more careful, to use salt more efficiently, to consider long-term impacts. But the fundamental need remains. We need salt for food, for industry, for safety, for health. Balancing that need with environmental responsibility is one of the ongoing challenges. In your kitchen, right now, there's probably salt, in a shaker on the table, in the cabinet, maybe several types. You use it without thinking. Sprinkle it on food, add it to recipes, gargle with it when you have a sore throat. It's cheap, abundant, unremarkable. But that salt represents thousands of years of human ingenuity, effort, struggle, innovation. It connects you to every person who ever produced salt, ever traded it, ever needed it. To the woman in ancient Romania boiling brine, to the Roman soldier receiving his salarium, to the medieval miner carving salt deep underground, to the African trader crossing the desert, to Gandhi picking up salt on a beach. They all handled this same substance, sodium chloride. Simple, essential. The story of salt is, in many ways, the story of civilization itself. It's about necessity driving innovation, about trade creating connections, about resources shaping power, about simple things mattering deeply. It's about humans solving problems, finding what we need, building systems to distribute it, improving those systems over generations. We don't think about salt now because we solved the salt problem, made it abundant, made it accessible, made it invisible. That invisibility is success. But maybe, occasionally, it's worth thinking about, worth appreciating, worth understanding. Because the things that seem simple usually aren't. They're the result of countless decisions, countless innovations, countless people working to make life a little better, a little easier, a little more secure. Salt is one of those things. White crystals. Ordinary. Extraordinary. So the next time you reach for salt, pause for just a moment. Feel the weight of it in your hand. The texture of the crystals. Think about where it came from, how it was made, how it got to you. Think about the 6,000 years of human history embedded in that simple substance, and be grateful that we live in a time of abundance, that we've solved problems our ancestors struggled with, that we've built a world where salt is easy. That wasn't always true. For most of human history, it wasn't true. But now it is. That's progress. That's civilization. That's the long arc of human effort bending toward making life better. One small thing at a time. One innovation at a time. One generation building on the last. Until we arrive here. Now. Where salt is abundant and cheap and available to everyone. Where we can forget about salt entirely. And focus on other problems. Other challenges. Other frontiers. Because we solved this one. Together. Over thousands of years. That's worth remembering.